In this section, we'll talk about flexibility as well as rehabilitation and taking care of your lower back to prevent injury. We've previously defined flexibility as the range of motion about a joint and discussed the fact that for most folks, this is the physical fitness component that gets overlooked the most frequently. It is affected by your age. We typically lose mobility and flexibility as we age. And in general, all things being equal, females are more flexible than males. And we know that there's a relationship between your range of motion or ability to move freely and injuries. There's also a genetic component to how much flexibility we have. And also, the types of activities that we do day to day impact our flexibility, mobility, because if we spend an extended amount of time in a certain position, then that will ultimately change the range of motion about a joint and potentially our risk for injury. And then just keep in mind that range of motion from one joint to another can vary dramatically. And as we see sometimes, folks are more flexible in the upper body versus lower body, or even maybe a difference in side to side of the body. Next, let's talk about types of stretching. And the first is a ballistic stretch, sometimes called a bouncing stretch. And this is where we use the body's momentum to provide or to create the stretch. So if I am not very flexible, for example, and I want to reach down and touch my toes, and the only way I can do that is by placing my arms overhead and really forcing the hands to come down towards the toes. That is a bouncing sort of stretch because I'm using the body's momentum to try to force me into a range of motion that I can't usually get into. And this can cause injury, and it actually tightens up the muscles rather than stretching the muscles, which is our goal. And so this type of stretching, there are some times when it's appropriate in athletics, but for what we do, our activities, ballistic stretching would not be appropriate. So let's talk about other types of stretching that we certainly want to include in our workouts. And the next one is dynamic stretching. And this is the equivalent of our warm-up routine, in that we're gradually increasing our range of motion, doing about 8 to 10 reps of an activity or of an exercise, if you will, in a light way to increase the blood flow to the muscle and also to bring up the core temperature, increase blood flow, and get the muscles ready for physical exercise. And it's important to remember that even if you're going out to run or ride your bike or whatever, just going at an easy walk or a jog as your warm-up is really not the best way to warm up. Your dynamic warm-up should allow you to move in all different planes or directions. So I should do some forward and back movements, and then side to side, and then even some motions that allow me to rotate and move side to side as well. And this warms up all the muscles that are used during an activity. The next type of stretching is static stretching, and as the name implies, it's really a slow stretch that's held for 10 seconds or longer. There are two types of static stretching, and you need to know the difference. The active type of static stretching is where we use the opposing muscle group to the one that we want to stretch to actually create the stretch. So what I'm going to have you do here is set your feet flat on the floor, and in this position, I want you to keep your heels on the ground and pull your toe up towards the ceiling, up towards your the ceiling, and then hold that position. So although you feel the muscle in the front outside of your shin contracting, you're getting a stretch in the calf muscle in the back of the leg. And we would hold that 10 seconds. And so that's considered active because I actually have an active contraction in that opposing muscle group in the front of the shin to create the stretch in the calf. And then another type of static stretching is passive. And in this one, as the name implies, I'm just using some type of assistance in order to hold me in a position that I need to enable the stretch. And I could use a chair, I might use a stretch strap or a towel. There are any number of assistance devices that I could use. So, for example, if you stand next to your chair and take your heel and prop it up on the chair with your legs straight and then get nice and tall and then hinge from the hips, and you'll feel a stretch in your hamstring. Now, if you can't keep your legs straight on the chair, then go ahead and find something lower. It doesn't have to be the height of a chair. It could be a couple of steps. If you're standing on the ground and you're next to a couple of stairs, place your heel on the second or third step. Get nice and tall, and then hinge from the hips so the back isn't rounded. And then you're using essentially the chair or the step for your assistance to get the stretch. So try this one as well. You should feel it in the back of the thigh. The last type of stretching we'll talk about is what we call PNF, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. For our purposes, we'll just call it PNF. And sometimes this is called contract, relax, stretching. What you do is you essentially get in a position where you're stretching the muscle that you want to target. And then in this position, you contract that muscle for about 3 to 6 seconds, and then release the contraction, stay in that position, and then hold the stretch another 10 to 30 seconds. And then you can repeat that 2 or 3 times. Typically, what happens after you've held the contraction 3 to 6 seconds and you relax it, then you can, for example, with the hamstring stretch, you can hinge forward a little bit further. And for folks who are really tight, sometimes this type of stretching works really well because it actually triggers a reflex that causes a muscle to relax. And the hamstring stretch, seated on the floor with one leg in front, if you look at that link, you'll see that that is an example of a PNF stretch for the hamstrings. So next, let's talk about when to do static stretching, because there's obviously a lot of new information about static stretching and how it's not recommended before a workout. And we've already discussed how we definitely want to do a dynamic warm-up with our dynamic stretching before we do an activity like weight training or some kind of cardiovascular training. But is it ever okay to do any static stretching before your workout? And the answer to that is yes. If you have already done your dynamic warm up and you have an area that is still really tight, like a muscle group, or an area that you have a problem with in terms of injury, it's okay to do a nice short stretch. I wouldn't hold it more than about 10 seconds if it's before your workout. And you can certainly do your static stretching because it's indicated at the end of your after your resistance training or aerobic exercise, and even after a shower is a great time to do some static stretching. So the main thing is we don't do static stretching before a warm up unless it's just for some targeted type muscle groups after we've already done the dynamic warm-up. And any done before the workout we keep to a nice short amount of time, 10 seconds or less. And then we can hold them 30 to 60 seconds all the way up to a minute if we wanted to post exercise. Now let's apply our FITT principle to flexibility. So how often should we stretch? Well, the minimum is 2 to 3 days a week. And ideally, we should do it every day, and we should stretch all the major muscle groups each day after our exercise, whether that is weight training or cardio. As far as intensity, that refers to what is the tightness level of the stretch. And it should feel like a slight tightness or discomfort, but it should not hurt. If it hurts, then you have too much tension on the muscle and you need to relax the stretch a little bit. The first T, as we said, is for time. And now this is talking about the total time of the workout here, meaning it shouldn't take you more than 10 minutes to do your flexibility. And for some folks, 5 minutes is certainly adequate. As far as holding the static stretch after a workout, we said that ideally that would be 10 to 30 seconds. You could certainly go longer than that if you wanted to, but the recommendation is 10 to 30 seconds. And we talked about the protocol for the P&F type of stretching, where you actually contract the muscle group in your stretch position that you want to work on, and then relax it, and then move into your stretch a little more, and then hold that 10 to 30 seconds, and then repeat as many times as you need to get the flexibility you want. And so each stretch that you do, regardless of whether it's a static or a P&F stretch, can be repeated 2 to 4 times. And our goal ultimately would be to get 60 seconds total of stretching for each muscle group if we added each of those times that we stretch that muscle group together. So that would be ideal, but just remember that some stretching is better than none. And so just don't skip the stretching. If you don't have much time, then focus on the muscle groups that are tightest for you. The last T refers to type of exercise. And obviously we want to stretch all the major muscle groups, but here we're really referring to, do I choose static stretching, dynamic stretching, or P&F stretching? Next, let's talk about acute care for an injury. First, let's define what is an acute injury. And an acute injury is one that has just happened, versus a chronic injury is an injury that's come on slowly and it's bothered me for some time. So what we're talking about here is how to care for an injury that just happened. And we use the acronym called RICE to help us remember what to do. So the R stands for rest. We need to rest the injured area for about 24 to 48 hours, but we still need to maintain our fitness during that time. So if I have an injury to my lower extremity, then it doesn't keep me from using my arms. I could use like an upper body type of ergometer. It looks like a bicycle, but I'm using my arms to power it. Or I could go to the gym and lift weights on my upper body, and vice versa. So the key is to maintain your fitness level as best you can, but rest the injured area. The I stands for ice. Typically, the recommendation is to ice 10 minutes on and 10 minutes off. You can do that a couple of times, especially if you have a lot of, 2 or 3 times if you have a lot of swelling. And it'll also help cut down on the pain. You can do this every hour during the day initially if you have a lot of pain and swelling. If you're using a cold pack that you store in the freezer, it's really important that you take a thin damp cloth like a washcloth or something and put it between the skin and the pack to prevent frostbite. If you're using ice and placing it in a bag, you don't necessarily have to have that cloth between the ice and the skin. And the studies actually show that the bag of ice does a better job of cooling and reducing the pain and penetrating further into the injured area than does the cold pack type of materials that we store in our freezer. So just keep that in mind. But you can use either one. And then the C stands for compression. That just means wrap the area to prevent swelling. And you could use a compression wrap to do that, kind of like an ACE bandage. And then the E is for elevation, meaning raising the injured area up above the heart level to reduce pain, bruising, and swelling. And the ideal situation is to actually do all of these essentially at the same time. So if I injured my knee, I could take some ice, place it on my knee, wrap my knee with an ACE bandage at the same time, and then also elevate my leg as I was icing it. And so I would actually be accomplishing all four of these at the same time. Once the pain and swelling have subsided, then we would look more what to do as far as rehabbing the area. A lot of times where folks get into trouble is they wait a couple of days, they wait till the pain and the swelling is gone, and then they jump right back into their sports, not realizing that within really 24 to 48 hours, the muscles that are impacted actually start to lose strength, and then you also lose mobility as those muscles tighten up to try to guard the injured joint or area of the body from any further pain. And so it's real important to get your range of motion and your strength back, and then actually be able to do the functional movements in your sport. And so, for example, if you wanted to get back to soccer, then you would have to be able to do some cutting, so moving back and forth across the field, changing directions quickly. And so each one of those is sort of what we call a step in the process. So I would start out with some gentle stretching for all of the muscles around the injured area to try to restore the mobility first. The last thing you want to do is start strengthening when you don't have adequate range of motion yet, because you're only strengthening in a limited range of motion, which is going to set you up for another injury. And so on this one, it would be the same guidelines as our FIT principle for flexibility. We would hold it 10 to 30 seconds to a point of mild tension. And then again, we could obviously do that multiple times throughout the day. And then our next step, once we regain our range of motion, would be then to start with the strengthening of the injured area. And so we don't just strengthen the muscle group that might have been injured, but we strengthen all of the muscle groups around a joint that get injured, what we call the antagonistic and agonistic muscles around the joint. And that way we come back to a point where we have a balance in strength on all sides of the muscle. And then finally, after I get my strength back, then I would start doing the functional training so I could return to my sports and activities. So things that would prepare me, say, for example, to go back to running or soccer, the example we gave before, or basketball. So I would want to make sure that I've done some activities to teach my body how to jump properly, land properly, so that I don't re-injure this area again. Next, let's turn our attention to back injuries. The statistics show that 80% of people suffer a low back injury during their lifetime, and of that 80%, 80% of those folks have a reoccurrence. So it's a very common injury and problem, really in throughout the whole United States. The causes of back and neck pain and related injury are number one, overweight. And literally, for every 1 pound of excess weight that someone carries around, it's like causing 10 additional pounds of stress on the back. So, some folks, merely by losing weight, can eliminate a lot of their low back problems. And then another big area is poor posture. And unfortunately, in these days and times, we spend a lot more time at the computer, on our phone, and so forth. So we tend to get this posture where our shoulders are rounded, meaning our chest muscles are tight, and then our head moves forward. And your head really is like the weight of a bowling ball. And when it's pulled forward, it puts a lot of stress on the neck versus if you can keep the head directly over the shoulders, there's not much stress at all placed on the neck. And for every inch that your head moves forward, it's like increasing the work in the muscles of your neck, the work that the neck muscles have to do, by a factor of 10. And then the other thing is, a lot of times we sit in a slouch position. So not only our shoulders forward, but our low back is rounded and we're hunched over the computer or the phone. And then we're looking down versus looking straight ahead, with our head right over our shoulders and then our chin being level. And these are all things that we can easily change and control as long as we are aware of them. So additional causes of back and neck pain and injury are presented on this slide. So for example, a lot of times folks will stand with their back too arched or too flat. You should have a natural curve in the back that should be well between your flattest position of the back and your most arched position, what we call a neutral spine. And for a lot of folks, they spend all of their standing and sitting time either with their back flat or with their back extremely arched. And the back is most resistant to injury whenever it's in that mid position. Too much sitting in general places more stress on the back because there's no way to align the back in its ideal position when you're seated. You can do it standing if you keep that neutral spine, but not in the seated position. When you stand with your knees locked, it forces your pelvis into an unusual position, which causes the back to arch. That also can contribute to low back pain. The knees need to be slightly bent when you're standing, just barely bent, short of being locked out. People stand with their knees locked out because it's easier. You're just kind of hanging there by your ligaments, which connect your bones together, and not really using the muscles to do the work. And so when you first start standing with your knees slightly bent, you're going to be a little bit tired until your muscles get used to that. And then poor biomechanics is another reason. We see a lot of times where folks get injured merely picking light objects up off the floor just because their form is not good. And how we lift heavy objects as well as light objects are important in terms of preventing injury. And again, like with sitting, just spending too much time on the phone or the computer increases our risk of injury as well. Next, let's take a look at standing posture, as this will be one of your assignments. Because what we're going to do is take a picture of yourself, a full body picture from the front and from the side, but standing as you normally would. Don't change anything for the picture. If you try to change your posture and make it better, you really don't learn anything about your true posture. So let's look at the right side of the screen first. And what we see there from the anterior or front view is that the ears are level, shoulders are level, and oftentimes we see, if you're right-handed, that your right shoulder's lower, and then your hips are level, and you want your knees facing forward, your thumbs facing forward. You want to make sure that the knees are not rolled in, And you want the feet facing forward and not turned out too much. So note if the feet are forward, if one's out more than the other. And then you want to make sure that the arch is supported so it's not collapsed in, so that people are rolling in on their shoes or rolling out on their shoes. And so for your picture that you take, it's better if you're barefoot because you can see that better when you don't have a shoe that's supporting your arch. Now when we go to the side view, we have a full body view. And if I were to draw a vertical line from the outside of my foot, right where that ankle bone sticks out that kind of sits on the top of above your shoe, and you drew a straight line vertically towards the ceiling, it would go through your knee. It'd be a little bit on to the anterior front part of the knee, go through the hip, through the spine, right through the center of the shoulder, and then right through your ear where the ear hole is. Ideally, your chin would be level. Your thumbs would be facing forward. So this would be our ideal posture, and you'll get a chance to evaluate this. From the side view, this is a summary of all the points that we want to look at when we evaluate posture. Now from the front view. So this is just a summary of what we talked about. This is your assignment in which you will evaluate your posture. So you'll take a photo of yourself, or someone else can do that. You'll take one standing as you normally would. Do not change your posture in any way. You'll do two views, one from the front, one from the side. You'll compare it to the examples in this video or in this PowerPoint, and you'll use your posture assignment checklist. And then for any deviations from what we would call optimal posture that you determine during your assessment, then you will select some exercises, which we'll talk about later in this PowerPoint, to add into your weekly workout. These are some of the more common postural errors that we see, and individuals may exhibit components of several of these types of posture. So you might just see if you recognize any of your postural deviations in these pictures. Now let's take a look at proper seated posture. As you can see in the diagram, the ear hole, okay, and the shoulder and the hips should be nice and aligned. The chin is level, and the monitor is raised up so that you can see the monitor well without having to look down. And then the arm there is at 90 degrees. And the ideal situation really is to use a mouse rather than the trackpad on your laptop, or even using your cell phone or your iPad, where you're constantly moving across the screen. This allows you to keep your shoulder back and towards your side if you use the mouse. A lot of times what happens if we allow the hand to turn in towards the center of the body, then that tightens up the shoulder and the chest, pulls the shoulders forward, and also pulls the head forward. And if you notice in this position, they're sitting nice and upright, and their back is actually supported. They could actually have a small pillow or some kind of a support there in the low back to take some of the stress off the muscles if they're sitting for very long. And then notice that the chair is adjusted to a height where you got that 90-degree bend at the knee. So what I want you to do today is when you're working in a seated position, I want you to see if you can adjust your workstation to get something close to this position. And I know you aren't necessarily all working at a true desk station, but I want you to try to set it up as best you can to that, and stay tall and sit tall whenever you're working. So what is proper lifting technique, especially if you're lifting something heavy, but it really applies to anything that we do. If I pick up a piece of paper off the floor versus a heavy box, I should really still be using the same form. And if you look at this diagram, what we see is the first thing that happens is rather than bending over, which can be really hard on the back, the individual kind of takes a wide stance and then squats down and gets next to the box so that the box is very close to the body. When you're lifting something, you want to keep it as close as you can. The further away creates a longer lever arm and more stress on the body. And then notice that he comes up, he stays nice and tall in his squat and uses the legs to lift the box off the floor rather than bending over the top of the box and lifting it with the back. The legs are much stronger and the glutes are much stronger muscles than the muscles in the low back, and they're really what are designed to lift heavy things, not the back itself. And then the individual can raise the box up nice and table height, if you will. And so from here, if the individual needed to move the box to the side rather than going straight ahead, then they would step and turn to the side rather than twisting with the box. That is one of the biggest scenarios of injury, is when someone's torso is flexed forward and then they're rotating to the side at the same time. So we want to make sure that they're two different movements, lifting the box, and then if we need to turn and take some steps to place the box, say on a table, then we would actually move the feet, turn towards the table, and place the box there. So this next slide is really just a summary of the things that we talked about: lifting with your legs, not your back, keeping the load close, squatting with the feet wide, especially if it's a heavy load, turning with your feet, not twisting, and not moving too quickly.